Okay guys, it's 12 o'clock, so I'm going to start this lecture if you want to find a seat. Before I start on the lecture proper, I've got two very brief announcements for you. The first announcement relates to the exam. So the take-home exam is available, it's on Views, and it's due this Friday by 4 p.m. So good luck with the exam. The second announcement that I wanted to make is that the Week 10 lecture, which would be the lecture following the break here at Bankstown, that Monday is actually a public holiday, it's Labor Day. So I've rescheduled the lecture. I've put a notice up on Views about this, but just so you know, the Week 10 lecture for you guys here at Bankstown has been rescheduled to Tuesday, the 2nd of October, from 12 to 1 p.m, and it's going to be in room BA 23.G.30. I'll say that again quickly. So it's been rescheduled to Tuesday, the 2nd of October, from 12 to 1 p.m. in room BA 23.G.30. You're all welcome to come. If you can't come, the lecture will be video recorded and it will be available, I'd say, by that Thursday. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to audio record it. I need to follow that up because it's not a regular room. But there's a notice up about that in Views if you want to reconfirm the location and so on. Okay, so this is the first lecture on Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein. Frankenstein, I'm going to be giving two lectures on this novel. Frankenstein was published in 1818 during the period of Romanticism, which I'm going to be talking about this week and next week. And it's a novel that explores a number of key themes of this unit. It's obviously a story about kinship and family. It's a story that's concerned with questions of origins. Are you guys right? There's a lot of chattering going on. Thanks. Okay, so it's a story that's concerned with origins, where we come from, family relationships. And it's also concerned with questions of belonging or unbelonging, whether or not individuals are accepted within or exiled from their communities. So I'm going to be exploring these themes in the coming weeks. It's also a cautionary tale about the dangers of unrestrained ambition and also the unanticipated consequences of human knowledge, particularly scientific knowledge. So it sort of explores the question, well, just because we can do something or just because we can create something doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea. It's just been part of the moral dilemmas around science and human discovery for many centuries. So in this novel, Victor Frankenstein, through his scientific experiments and also through his ambition, he's a very ambitious character, he effectively changes the conventional rules that apply to life and death. And in this way, Shelley's novel anticipates many contemporary moral debates about the relationship between knowledge, particularly science and medicine, and human life. Okay? So, for example, what Victor Frankenstein wants to do, there's sort of three things that he's aiming for in his experiments. He's interested in finding the source of life itself. He's interested in causes, he says. He's also aiming to create a new kind of human, isn't he? He wants to try and create a human that might be more powerful, more robust, immune to disease. And the third thing that he has to do in order to create his creature is he needs to reanimate the dead. I don't know how far you've got through the novel, but he takes parts from different cadavers, doesn't he? And he kind of stitches them together into this superhuman. Okay, so three of these things, the desire to find the source of life itself, the desire to create a new or a variant kind of species, and the reanimation of the dead, I want to suggest that modern science can do at least two of these things. And often society struggles in moral terms to keep up with scientific discoveries and capabilities. So, for example, to think about contemporary times, there are a number of things that have changed the conventional or natural rules that apply to life and reproduction. These include things like cloning and genetic engineering, IVF, abortion, life support, organ donation. I could keep going. There's a number of other things. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that any of these scientific or medical discoveries are monstrous in the way that Victor Frankenstein thinks his creation is monstrous. But these are issues that do continue to generate moral debate and to challenge our ideas about what we can do, what we should do, what the nature of the human might be, what makes a life livable. Okay? And if I take the last example, what makes a life livable, Victor is so obsessed with the idea of creating this particular kind of species, he doesn't really, this creature, he doesn't really think through what its life might be like, right? And that's part of the problem, because the creature feels alone. It feels alone and kind of abandoned in the world. That's one of the themes that I'll come back to in the second lecture. Now, I think the way in which Frankenstein anticipates the kind of tension between morality, society, and scientific discovery is one of the ways in which this novel is actually very, very prophetic. It imagines things that's quite incredible, considering that it was published in 1818. And I think it's also one of the reasons why it continues to be a very interesting story for contemporary readers, because it resonates with issues in our own world. In this lecture, what I'm going to be doing is three things. I'm going to be talking about origins, the origins of the novel, and a little bit about the author, Mary Shelley. I'm also going to be talking about some of the key context for the novel. This unit, Texts and Traditions, as you know, this semester is focusing on the Western tradition, and we're trying to locate the texts that you're reading within their cultural and their intellectual contexts. And there are three contexts that are really important for understanding this novel, and they're ones that you'll definitely come across again in your future studies in the humanities. So they are the Enlightenment, the Gothic, and also Romanticism, which I mentioned a few weeks ago. So I'm going to talk briefly about these three contexts and how they relate to the novel. And then in the sort of second half of the lecture, I'll be focusing on the topic of fathers and the desire to create in relation to the character of Victor Frankenstein. Okay, so origins. The novel Frankenstein actually had its beginnings in a ghost story writing competition that was proposed by one of the Romantic poets, a guy called Lord Byron. You don't need to know all this is just background. I've got a photo of Lord Byron coming up. But he proposed it when Mary Shelley and Mary Shelley's husband, Percy, and some other friends were holidaying in Geneva in 1816. They'd basically gone to Geneva to tour the countryside, which is what Romantic poets often did. And the weather was really bad. They spent a lot of time indoors. And Byron said, let's pass the time by reading some ghost stories. So they were reading some German ghost stories, and then Byron suggested that they should have a ghost story writing competition. They all started stories, but Mary was the only person who finished hers. It took her about 1 year to write the novel. As I said, it was published in January 1818. And Mary Shelley was only 18 when she wrote this novel, which I think is pretty remarkable. And it was her most famous novel. Mary Shelley herself is quite an interesting woman, and her family is also worth mentioning. So I'm going to say a couple of things about her. Mary Shelley was the child of two very famous people of the time. Her father, that's a picture of Mary Shelley on the right as a young woman. The painting on the left is it's a painting within the Gothic tradition. I don't have time to talk about it, but you might want to have a look at it in your own time. So Mary Shelley's father was a man called William Godwin, and he was a very radical political and philosophical thinker of his day. He was influenced by Enlightenment ideas. I'll explain what that means in a little while, and also the social and the political kind of ideas underpinning the French Revolution. So he was a progressive thinker, very progressive and quite radical political and philosophical thinker. He was previously a minister who became an atheist. Okay, so it's the kind of level of radicalism we're talking about in the late 18th century. Mary Shelley's mother, whose picture is there on the right, was a woman called Mary Wollstonecraft. She was also a very radical Enlightenment thinker and writer of her day. And she is a founding figure in what we would now call feminist thought and feminist politics. She wrote a very influential tract called The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which was published in 1972. And what she basically did in that tract was criticize conventional ideas, patriarchal ideas about women of the day, that women should be passive, naive, and just limited to the domestic sphere. And she famously argued that women are as capable of rational thought as men, which was an unconventional idea of the time. But she said that in order to be rational, women had to be educated. So she was very much in support of the idea of education for all. And again, this was towards the end of the 18th century, so very progressive ideas. She also, along with her partner Godwin, were kind of against the institution of marriage. she referred famously to marriage as a kind of legal prostitution. Okay, so the point being that Mary Shelley came from radical intellectual stock. Mary Wollstonecraft gave birth to Mary Shelley in 1797, and tragically she died just 10 days later. So the notable absence of mothers and the prevalence of mothers dying throughout Frankenstein can, I think, be understood to reflect this formative personal trauma in Mary Shelley's life. She never knew her mother, and her mother died giving birth to her. And a lot of the anxieties and issues around absent mothers, problems with creation in this novel, I think, reflect this personal experience. When Mary Shelley was 16, she met and she fell in love with this guy on the right, Percy Shelley, who would become one of the really famous second-generation Romantic poets. And they were very close friends with the guy on the right, Lord Byron, a very dashing figure. And he was also another of the famous second-generation Romantic poets. In addition to losing her mother, Mary Shelley lost 3 of her 4 children. She lost Percy in a boating accident in 1822, and she also lost their good friend Byron to illness in 1924. So it's been suggested that the trials of life and death, which seem to be so central to the novel of Frankenstein and a lot of Shelley's other writing, perhaps reflect these experiences that she had as a child and as a young woman. If you're interested in Shelley's life, there's more information on that in the introduction to your novel, to your edition of the novel. Okay, so moving on to these contexts that I wanted to talk about, there are many different scientific, philosophical, and also literary contexts that inform this novel. And to really get an understanding of it, you need to know something about them. And I'm going to be mentioning these not only in this lecture, but in the lecture after the break as well. So the first of these that I wanted to talk about is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, which is also commonly referred to as the Age of Reason. This refers to a period in the history of Western, particularly European thought and culture that extended from around the middle of the 17th century through to the 18th century. And the Enlightenment is basically characterized by all kinds of developments and really revolutions in philosophy, in science, and in politics as well. Okay, so all areas of human thought and culture were kind of being reformed during this period. And the Enlightenment basically marks the replacement of the old medieval worldview, the kind of world that's presented in Hamlet, with our own modern worldview. So the Enlightenment has continued to have an influence in terms of our contemporary politics and our contemporary philosophy as well. That's why it's so important. And this is something you'll come across in your studies in future semesters. So it basically marks the kind of beginning of our modern society as we know it. So the Enlightenment doesn't really refer to a specific kind of theory, but a general kind of shift or development, a kind of a progress that was going on, particularly in Western Europe and latterly in America during the 17th and the 18th centuries. One of the key events that underpinned the Enlightenment was the French Revolution. I've got an image relating to the French Revolution up there on the left-hand side. And the French Revolution extended from 1789 to 1799, and what occurred basically was the overthrow of the French monarchy, the kind of uprising of the people, also the overthrow of feudalism as well, and the movement towards a more democratic form of governance in France. And all throughout Europe, other countries and other governments and so on were looking at what was happening in France with real anxiety because they saw revolution, a kind of a spirit of revolution to be spreading throughout Europe. Okay, so in addition to the French Revolution, I wanted to mention some of the key ideas that underpin Enlightenment thinking, ideas that resonate throughout Frankenstein. So the first one had to do with ideas about knowledge. Prior to the Enlightenment, the kind of foundations for knowledge were often seen to be based in scripture, okay, in religious kind of authority, religious documents, in superstition, in faith, and in belief. But the Enlightenment proposed that the real grounds for knowledge are reason, our capacity as rational subjects, and also science. Okay? The Enlightenment sees a kind of uprising of science as a new kind of domain of knowledge. And this, of course, we see in Frankenstein, as I'll discuss. So new models of knowledge central to the Enlightenment Another key idea was that Enlightenment thinkers like this guy, Immanuel Kant, a very famous German philosopher of the Enlightenment, advocated the ideas that individuals shouldn't be tied to tradition or be told what to think, but should be able to think independently and rationally for themselves. Okay, so that we're all autonomous free thinkers who can use our reason to make our own judgments about things. This is an idea that's absolutely central to our own thinking about knowledge today. Also, the Enlightenment had enormous faith and optimism in humans and what we could achieve through knowledge, through science, and later through technology. So the Enlightenment was very interested in ideas of progress and development, okay? Something that we call often modernity. And this, again, is central to our thinking in the present day. So huge optimism and faith in terms of humans and what we can achieve. And it also saw, as I've mentioned, this general shift from kind of hierarchical, feudal forms of society to more democratic forms as well. So with this sort of emphasis in progress and in the idea of new futures, the Enlightenment very much favoured the new and the future rather than the old and the past. And this is again key to a concept of modernity, which I've mentioned. So there's a number of ways in which the Enlightenment and Enlightenment ideas filter throughout this novel, Frankenstein. I'll give you a couple of examples. We see it in relation to ideas of knowledge. So you remember when Frankenstein goes off to study at Ingolstadt, he's told by Professor Krempe that he has to give up wasting his time on ancient and outdated works, like those of the medieval magician Cornelius Agrippa, who he read as a young man, and also the alchemist and physician Paracelsus, and that he needs to start reading contemporary works of natural philosophy. This is what Krempe advises him. So basically this is suggesting that it's out with the old and in with the new. You've got to give up superstitious kind of belief in magic and alchemy, and you've got to get down to the hard kind of facts of natural science, okay, of deduction and so forth. As I'll discuss, it seems in the novel that Frankenstein can't quite let go of the kind of aspirations of his old alchemists and magicians, but he does take on a lot of the new traditions of natural science and chemistry, as I'll discuss. But this is basically what Krempe says to Frankenstein. In what a desert land you have lived, where no one was kind enough to inform you that these fancies which you have so greedily imbibed are 1,000 years old and as musty as they are ancient. I little expected in this enlightened and scientific age to find a disciple of Albertus Magnus and Paracelsus. My dear sir, you must begin your studies entirely anew. Okay? And even the figure of Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein is a scientist. He's a modern figure. He's an Enlightenment figure. Another way in which the Enlightenment kind of filters through the novel is in terms of the spirit of adventure and discovery and the belief in progress through knowledge, which is expressed by Victor Frankenstein, but also by Robert Walton, the other kind of adventurer that features and that retells Frankenstein's story. So Frankenstein has enormous intellectual ambitions, doesn't he? He wants to basically create a new kind of human being, right? And he also wants to bring back the dead to life. So the kind of scale of his ambitions are enormous, but he also expresses a sort of an Enlightenment optimism in terms of what he might do with his discoveries. Maybe he'll eradicate disease and illness from the human frame. These are big ambitions, and I think kind of Enlightenment in their optimism. Okay, so as you go through the novel, I want you to think about how these ideas of perhaps reason and science are explored and are dealt with. Because one of the things I want to suggest, and I'll be exploring through the course of these lectures, is that Mary Shelley engages with these different contexts, the Enlightenment, Romanticism, but she also criticises aspects of them as well. And I'll be explaining how she does that as I go through. Okay, so the second context that I wanted to mention briefly is the Gothic, and particularly the literary Gothic. Okay, so the literary Gothic emerged in the 1760s, second half of the 18th century, around about the same time as the Enlightenment. And the important thing that you need to understand about the Gothic is that it's largely a reaction against the Enlightenment. Okay, Okay, the Gothic is largely understood as a reaction against the Enlightenment. So, counter to the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, the Gothic is interested in the irrational, in excess of emotion, in the sensational, and in the dark aspects of human nature. What we come to call in the 20th century after Freud, the unconscious. Okay? The Gothic's very interested in the unconscious. So it's a very anti-rational kind of tradition. One of the key features of Gothic fiction is suspense. And Frankenstein has suspense in bucketfuls, and it achieves this through its form. And I'm going to talk more about the form in the next lecture. But a conventional Gothic novel, an 18th century Gothic novel, would generally be set in the past. It was often set in the medieval period. It would generally feature a scary castle. It would generally involve a villain who might be a monk, as in the picture on the left. There's a really famous Gothic novel called The Monk, where the villain is, of course, a monk. Or the villain might be a lord, somebody of high standing, who's, of course, completely corrupt and immoral. And usually this villain is trying to seduce or corrupt an innocent, naive young maiden who's fleeing around the castle and underground vaults trying to escape him. That's kind of the crux of an 18th century Gothic novel. Now, while the 18th century Gothic tends to locate the source of Gothic horror and dread in the supernatural, Gothic novels are full of ghosts, paintings with eyes that move, all of that kind of stuff. The 19th century Gothic novel tends to be more realistic. Okay, it's more realistic. We have a shift in the style. 19th century Gothic novels, like Frankenstein, tend to be set in contemporary contexts. So Frankenstein is set in its own time, and it's set in a city for the most part. And usually, with 19th century Gothic horror, the source is often human or psychological rather than being supernatural. Okay, so the source of Gothic dread and horror tends to be human, believable, rather than being supernatural. There's a really good example of this, a later 19th century Gothic novel called The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Have any of you read that? If you haven't, it's a great late 19th century Gothic novel which explores that idea of kind of the dread being within us, horror being a part of us. Okay, so Frankenstein was a very original work of Gothic literature because it kind of signalled this shift from an 18th century to 19th century mode. It was very kind of groundbreaking in its time. The creature is superhuman, and it is definitely frightening to look at. It's obviously very ugly. But at the same time, the creature is a product of human matter, isn't it? It's not supernatural. It's a product of various human bodies. And also, it's a product of human creation and science. So it's not supernatural, it's of this world. It's something which, you know, it seems more real, more possible. The creature can also be interpreted as a projection or a manifestation of Victor Frankenstein's own dark, obsessive desires. Okay? I want you to think about that. The creatures are kind of a projection of Victor Frankenstein's own dark, obsessive, and indeed unholy desires, unnatural desires to create. So the novel Frankenstein features a number of Gothic spaces. I'm going to give you some examples shortly, like the graveyard and Dr. Frankenstein's lab, where he creates his creature. But the source of Gothic dread is both external and internal. It's in the creature, but it's also an exploration of human psychology and creation and what we can do, the implications of what we can do. So let me see if I've got an example of this for you. This image here is a frontispiece for the revised edition of Frankenstein, and here you can see that this is set in the lab. You can see the books on the shelf to the right-hand side with the row of skulls at the top. And you can see that Victor Frankenstein's running away. He's about to leave the room when his creature comes to life. And the creature is clearly in a state of distress or kind of confusion in this image, and that certainly reflects the situation in the novel. But you can see the ideas of learning and knowledge are kind of situated throughout this image. An example of Gothic spaces. Some of these black and white images I've got are from a 1970s edition of the novel, which my parents had when I was a kid, and that always fascinated me. I looked at the pictures a lot longer before I could actually before I was old enough to understand the novel, but they're quite interesting. I'll just give you one example of Gothic spaces in the novel. And this is him describing his activities. Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil, as I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave, or tortured the living animal to animate the lifeless clay. I collected bones from charnel houses and disturbed with profane fingers the tremendous secrets of the human frame. In a solitary chamber, or rather cell, at the top of the house, and separated from all the other apartments by a gallery and staircase, I kept my workshop of filthy creation. Okay? So this is a good example of Gothic literature at work, and your tutors might go through these and some other parts in a bit more detail in your tutorials. Okay, the third context that I wanted to mention briefly is Romanticism. All of these are working through the novel in different ways. I mentioned Romanticism a couple of weeks ago, and Romanticism was a movement in philosophy and in the arts that can also be understood as a kind of a reaction against the Enlightenment, okay, but in different ways. So while the Enlightenment was very much focused on a kind of a disciplined reason, Romantics, as I suggested, emphasised things like emotion and also imagination, the importance of imagination and creativity to human society and culture. Also, the Romantics were often quite sceptical of progress, of modernity. They often looked back nostalgically on the past. So they were not convinced that all of this newness was necessarily a good thing. And one of the ways in which that desire for the past is expressed in Romanticism is through the kind of reverence that Romantic poets and painters expressed for nature. Okay? Romantics saw nature as a source of truth, of spiritual regeneration. And Romantic poets wrote often extensively about the kind of wonders and value of nature for us, for our sort of spiritual well-being. And again, you'll see, as I'll discuss, Romantic ideas about nature figure in different ways in the novel. So I'm going to be talking about the novel's relationship to Romanticism in different ways, but the important thing to realise is that Mary Shelley was a figure who was steeped in English Romanticism. She was married to one of the most famous English Romantic poets of her day, and very much kind of a part of that system. And I think that she criticises aspects of Romanticism as well as reflecting them, and I'll talk about that briefly. I'll just show you a couple of images that relate to Romanticism. So this is one of the works by William Blake. And William Blake's another extremely famous Romantic poet and also painter and etcher. And his works were very much engaged with the idea of the imagination and mythology. He created his own incredibly complex mythologies. And this is from a series of paintings that feature red dragons. I'll show you one other example of Blake's work from a famous collection of poems called The Songs of Innocence and Experience. And the Songs of Innocence and Experience basically reflect upon human experience before and after the modern, okay? How the modern world affects our experience as individuals and as a community. So he does things like critique the city and look at child labour and look at industrialisation, and he idealises this kind of pre-industrial world. You can see in this plate The Shepherd, where he's kind of thinking back to the idyllic life of the shepherd out in the fields with his flock. Okay, so Romanticism is another context that I want you to have in your mind as you're reading this novel, as you're going through it. Okay, so that's context aside. Now I'll get into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of the novel. And I'm going to talk about fathers and creativity and the desire to create. Okay, so Victor Frankenstein's ambition, as I said, is extensive. He's interested in the sources of life and death, the secrets of heaven and earth, and he describes himself as being deeply smitten with the thirst for knowledge from a very young age. And he suggests that he was particularly interested in causes. It's on page 38, causes. Now, causes suggest origins, and origins, of course, links back to ideas of where we come from and also kinship. And he's wanting to unlock the secrets of heaven and earth. As I've said, he's interested in finding the source of life itself. He states this on page 42. That is, he wants to be, I think, a father, but more than that, Victor Frankenstein wants to take on kind of godlike powers. This is something that readers and critics of the novel have noticed ever since the novel was first published. He wants to take on godlike powers, and through this, to unlock the secrets of nature and help humanity. But Frankenstein realizes, and we see this from the very beginning of the novel with his discussions with Walton, that he's guilty of what we would call overreaching. He's guilty of overreaching. That is, his ambitions are too big, and he doesn't really properly think through the implications of what it is he's trying to achieve, or the broader social consequences of what he's trying to do. And I think his motivations are portrayed by Mary Shelley. While he suggests that they're intellectual and that they have some kind of social benefit, in fact, I think Shelley presents Victor Frankenstein's ambitions as being egotistical and also individual rather than social. It's worth noting that when this novel was first published, readers often tended to sympathise with Victor Frankenstein, but subsequent generations of readers have always sympathised with the creature. And I think that those different kind of relationships are interesting, and they reflect the different kinds of positions of readers in their own historical kind of moments when they're reading things. Okay, so Victor Frankenstein's sort of problem of overreaching and his desire for godlike powers actually fits into a long literary tradition of similar kinds of characters. And the most important reference point for this is the myth of Prometheus. Okay, the myth of Prometheus. It's a key source for this novel, and it's indicated in the subtitle because Mary Shelley called the novel Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Okay, so in the myth of Prometheus, it's a Greek myth, and Prometheus basically stole fire from the gods, from the god Olympus, in order to help and save humankind. And many romantic poets wrote versions of this myth, both Percy Shelley and Byron did. But the interpretation that really seems to have influenced Mary Shelley was one by the poet Ovid, the ancient poet Ovid. He changed the myth a little bit because in his version, Prometheus basically creates and manipulates men into life from clay. Okay, he uses clay to manipulate men into life. So that's sort of what Frankenstein does, except with body parts. Now, several poems by Percy Shelley and Lord Byron tended to celebrate and idealise this figure of a human being who wanted to take on godlike powers and save humanity. They liked the idea, the figure of the hero. And one good example of this kind of poem is The Alastor by Percy Shelley, where he idealises this kind of character. But Mary Shelley seems to be criticising this kind of figure, this sort of overreaching tendency. It's not something that's heroic, but it's something that is potentially very dangerous. Okay, so Shelley has a very different sort of attitude to the idea of the hero and a kind of an imagination gone wild. Okay, kind of a magic imagination gone wild. The second thing about Victor Frankenstein as a creator is probably the way in which he combines the old and the new in terms of his experiments. It's another thing I wanted to discuss. You remember that Frankenstein is advised by Krempe to give up the old kind of thinkers that he's been reading, the alchemists and the magicians, and to focus on the insights of natural philosophy and natural science. But Frankenstein doesn't want to give up the kind of ambitious aims of these alchemists and magicians he's been reading. So what he basically does is he combines the old with the new. He combines the old ambitions of his alchemists and magicians to find the source of life, to find the elixir of life, through using some of the new kinds of discoveries in natural philosophy and also in chemistry as well. Okay, particularly chemistry, galvanism, and anatomy. These are the three spheres of knowledge that Frankenstein draws on. Of particular relevance to his creation is the science of galvanism. Now, galvanism, I think I've got an image here. This is a cartoon from the 19th century about galvanism. So it had its beginnings in the experiments of a scientist called Luigi Galvani, who basically discovered the electrical basis of nerve impulses. That's what this guy discovered. He applied electrical shocks to dead frogs' legs and they moved, and that's how they understood the link between the nervous system and energy. But in Shelley's time, galvanism referred more broadly to the science of electricity, the science of electricity, and its possible uses and effects. Percy Shelley, Mary's husband, was fascinated with galvanism. He actually did a whole bunch of kind of galvanist experiments when he was at university. And during their trip to Geneva, apparently Mary listened to conversations between Percy and Byron about the possibility of reanimating a dead corpse by electrical means. So obviously this conversation had some influence on her. It sparked her imagination. Pardon the pun. But the use of galvanism in Frankenstein's process of creating the monster is evident in popular images of Frankenstein, you know, where you see him with bolts in his head and electrical kind of things coming out. I've got one example of this, from the novel that I had. So galvanism is an important kind of scientific context for Frankenstein's creation. So what Mary Shelley is doing is she's actually incorporating some of the new kind of intellectual developments and theories of the time into this story, this quite fantastic story about creating and reanimating a human being out of a sort of a kind of an assembly of different corpses, different body parts. The third broad thing that I wanted to say about, I'll just go back to this other cartoon. The third broad thing I wanted to say was about Victor Frankenstein's attitudes to family and lineage, because this is also important in terms of thinking about creation. It seems to me interesting that Victor Frankenstein is so hell-bent on disrupting and circumventing the normal orders of creation and also family and kinship, given that he describes himself as having had such a perfect childhood. And this is set up at the beginning of the novel. He talks in Volume 1, Chapter 2 about his perfect childhood. He says, "No human being could have passed a happier childhood than myself." He's always describing his parents as being incredibly generous and loving, his wonderful relationship with his adopted sister Elizabeth, his fantastic friend Clerval. You know, everything is kind of spoken in the most sort of elevated terms, how wonderful his family was. He's also quite interested too in ideas of origins, where people come from, and take note of the very careful description that Victor Frankenstein makes about his adopted sister Elizabeth. The fact that while she's adopted from a peasant family, she herself is of noble stock, Milanese stock. So origins are important to Frankenstein. But this doesn't cause him to really think through the implications of his creation, does it? Because origins is one, as you come to read the novel, you'll see that one of the problems the creature has is that it doesn't know really where it comes from. It doesn't have any family, and it feels that it's exiled from all kinds of communities. It doesn't have any kinship. It doesn't have any belonging. I'll talk about this more next week. But it's interesting that Victor Frankenstein doesn't anticipate any of these issues, even though he himself views family as so important. So Frankenstein's failure to acknowledge the importance of relations of kinship, his responsibilities to his child, and companionship, the creature's right to be part of a community, in turn results in the destruction of Victor's own family. And this is part of the irony of the novel. And I'll unpack this reading more in the next lecture. Okay, so there's a number of themes, important themes that are set up very early by Shelley in the novel. And these are themes that she's wanting to explore, to interrogate. Themes about Victor's character. How do we judge him? Walton, his friend, seems to idealize him, but the novel ultimately criticizes him. The importance of family. And also the relationship between fate and free will. These are all set up in the beginning chapters. Okay, the last topic that I wanted to talk about in terms of Frankenstein as father and his desire to create is how the novel explores the theme of the circumvention of the mother. The circumvention of the mother, and Frankenstein's relationship to Mother Nature more generally. Okay, so one way of thinking about this novel is that it's exploring the scenario of a man fathering forth without a mother. This idea of the circumvention of the mother in the process of creating human life. And this is, of course, in an era before gay marriage and, you know, all that other kind of stuff. We're talking about a different context. But the novel is full of absent mothers, as I've mentioned, and also mothers who are killed off. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. So Frankenstein's mother was an orphan, and she basically dies when she's looking after her adoptive daughter, Elizabeth. Elizabeth is also an orphan. She doesn't have a mother. And she becomes the kind of replacement mother to William and Victor later in the novel. Another mother figure, Justine, who acts as a foster mother, you might not have got to this character, she's later killed off as well. She's hung because she's accused of a murder. So when you start reading the novel, think about mother figures, how they're present, how they're made absent, and also the fluidity of motherhood throughout the novel. So the novel is full of both actual biological and also foster mothers as well. But the kind of recurring issue within the novel, it seems to me, is that Frankenstein's ambition seems to rely to some extent on the elimination of the mother, and this seems to have really dire consequences in the novel. In addition to the absence and killing off of human mothers, Shelley's novel also explores the consequences of man's desire to unlock and master the mysteries of nature. And nature is feminized at points throughout the novel. So it's kind of coded as Mother Nature. He repeatedly states, and I might move on to the next slide. I've got some examples here which you can think about in your own time, just about this idea of the circumvention of the mother. But Frankenstein repeatedly states his desire to, and I'm quoting here, penetrate the secrets of nature. It's on page 41, and to uncover her hidden laws on page 38. I don't have penetrate the secrets of nature. I've always described myself as having been imbued with a fervent longing to penetrate the secrets of nature. And it's interesting to note that Victor's ambitions here are described in notably sexual terms, aren't they? To penetrate the secrets of nature. Now, if you think back to the Pythagorean table of opposites that I mentioned the other week, you can see how the ideas of male and female unfold in this novel through the framework of a kind of a masculinist science that is trying to unlock the mysteries of a dark, inscrutable Mother Nature. And this kind of model is one that was actually replicated in the work of a philosopher called Francis Bacon, an Enlightenment philosopher. So this idea of Mother Nature is something dark, inscrutable, mysterious that needs to be kind of penetrated, unlocked, figured out. So Frankenstein's creation amounts to a kind of a grotesque and what some critics have described as an Oedipal violation of Mother Nature, disturbing with profane fingers the tremendous secrets of the human frame, ferreting around in the unhallowed damps of the grave. Okay, so the suggestion is that he is literally and metaphorically fiddling around in spaces that are dark, mysterious, abject, and taboo. Okay? So you might want to think about how that might link to the notion of, you know, the body of the mother in Freudian terms as being something that is taboo, should not be accessed, forbidden. And this is the kind of thing that metaphorically or symbolically Frankenstein is doing through his experiments. Something else is interesting to note, and I'm just going to kind of mention it here as a framework. You don't need to worry about essay questions about this, but I'm just trying to situate for you the novel in terms of some of its broader context. There's another very interesting dimension in terms of Victor Frankenstein's relationship with nature. And this is in volume 2 of the novel, in chapters 1 and 2. You'll find that once the full consequences of his creation have become clear to him, when a lot of his family have been murdered and the monster's basically running wild, what Victor Frankenstein does is he runs away off into nature. He goes off into the Alps. This is a very romantic thing to do. Okay, romantic poets were always going and having retreats off in the mountains as a kind of a source of regeneration and recuperation. So he goes into nature, Mother Nature, for consolation. And in particular, he describes, I think it's the second, chapters 1 and 2 of the second volume, his experiences in the Alps in terms of what we call the sublime, the romantic sublime. So the romantic sublime was this idea of a particular kind of aesthetic experience that we have in nature when we're confronted with the kind of power and the grandeur of a natural environment, like a turbulent ocean or big mountains. And for the Romantics, the idea was that these kinds of scenes were both exciting and also terrifying, and they gave us an idea, a sort of an intimation of the divine, of God, the spiritual, as present within the natural world. And I've got an example here from the novel, which is very much talking within the tradition of the Romantic Sublime. I'm going to explain what happens, the problem with this reading, in a second. But Frankenstein says, the immense mountains and precipices that overhung me on every side, the sound of the river raging among the rocks, and the dashing of the waterfalls around, spoke of a power mighty as omnipotence, that is God. And I ceased to fear or to bend before any being less almighty than that which had created and ruled the elements, here displayed in their most terrific guise. So what Frankenstein does at this point in the novel is he runs out into nature for relief, and he's saying, this is a mighty power of nature and I bend down to you. But what happens, and this is interesting when you get to it, is that he looks off into the distance and he sees something running towards him, and it's this creature running at superhuman speed towards him. And it breaks his sublime moment, okay? It ruptures it. So what I'd be suggesting here is that because Victor Frankenstein has actually disturbed some of the fundamental structures and laws of nature through his creation, that space can no longer be a source of consolation to him. This is what happens. And this is part of the very interesting way in which Mary Shelley explores romantic ideas about nature and romantic ideals and ideologies in the novel. So he goes out there for comfort, for consolation, but his own kind of disruption of the natural order means that the kind of model of the sublime and the kind of model of nature that the Romantics valued so highly is no longer available to him. His imagination, his creative imagination, has ruptured that relationship forever. So that's all I have to say about that today. Next week, or the week after the break, what I'm going to be focusing on is Frankenstein's reaction to and his relationship to his creature, the creature's story, and also how we might understand the creature in relation to concepts of the human and ideas of kinship as well. Have a good break.